The crisp, almost brittle, autumn air nipped at Artie Maxwell's cheeks as he surveyed the scene. Leaves, a riot of crimson and gold, swirled around his polished black boots, a stark contrast to the manicured, if somewhat sterile, landscape of the Willow Creek estates. Willow Creek, a gated community nestled in the heart of suburban Connecticut, prided itself on its pristine image, its meticulously maintained lawns, and its rigid adherence to the Homeowners Association bylaws. Artie, a recent transplant, had found it stifling. He wasn't your typical Willow Creek resident. He wasn't a retired dentist or a hedge fund manager looking for a quiet escape. Artie was, unbeknownst to his neighbors, the CEO of Harley-Davidson. He preferred leather jackets to tweed blazers, the rumble of a V-twin to the whir of a Tesla, and the open road to the manicured cul-de-sacs of suburbia. He had purchased the Willow Creek property as a temporary haven, a place to decompress after a particularly grueling year of navigating supply chain disruptions and volatile market fluctuations. He wanted peace, quiet, and a place to tinker with his latest project, a custom-built Harley, a beast of chrome and power he affectionately called the Widowmaker. The Widowmaker, however, was the crux of the problem. Its raw, untamed presence, its thunderous growl, was anathema to the serene, meticulously crafted aesthetic of Willow Creek. The HOA, a group of self-appointed guardians of suburban tranquility, had taken a dim view of Artie's motorcycle from the moment it rolled into his garage. They deemed it obnoxious, unsightly, and a blatant violation of the community's noise ordinance. Artie, accustomed to dealing with complex business negotiations and international trade agreements, had initially dismissed their complaints as trivial. He had politely pointed out that his garage was soundproofed, that he only rode the motorcycle during daylight hours, and that, frankly, it was his property and his motorcycle. He had even offered to install additional sound dampening measures, a gesture that was met with a chorus of pursed lips and disapproving glances. The HOA, led by the formidable Mrs. Eleanor van der Linde, a woman whose perfectly coiffed silver hair and steely blue eyes could intimidate a seasoned negotiator, was not to be deterred. They were determined to preserve the sanctity of Willow Creek, even if it meant waging a war against a single, solitary motorcycle. The first volley was a series of increasingly aggressive letters, each one filled with legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. Artie, busy with a critical product launch, had delegated the matter to his assistant, who had dutifully filed the letters away, assuming they were nothing more than the petty grievances of overzealous neighbors. Then came the fines. Small at first, but escalating with each passing week. Artie, oblivious to the growing financial burden, continued to focus on his work, assuming the matter would eventually resolve itself. He was, after all, the CEO of Harley-Davidson. Surely, a small-town HOA wouldn't dare challenge him. He was wrong. One crisp October morning, Artie returned from a business trip to find his garage empty. The Widowmaker, his pride and joy, his escape from the pressures of corporate life, was gone. A single, neatly typed letter lay on the floor of the empty garage, informing him that his motorcycle had been removed due to repeated violations and unpaid fines. It further stated that the motorcycle would be sold at auction if the fines were not paid within 7 days. Artie's blood ran cold. He felt a surge of anger, a raw, primal rage that he hadn't experienced since his days as a young, scrappy entrepreneur. This wasn't just about a motorcycle. It was about principle, about the blatant overreach of authority, about the audacity of a small-town HOA to seize and sell his property. He stormed into his house, his boots echoing on the polished hardwood floors, and grabbed his phone. He dialed his lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Sarah Jenkins, and laid out the situation in a clipped, furious tone. "They sold my bike, Sarah," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger. "They actually sold my bike." "Sold it?" Sarah's voice was incredulous. "Without a court order? Without due process?" "Apparently," Artie said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They have their own version of due process here in Willow Creek. It involves seizing property and holding impromptu auctions." Sarah sighed. "This is outrageous, Artie. I'll look into it immediately. We'll file a restraining order, demand the return of your motorcycle, and sue them for everything they're worth." Artie hung up the phone, his mind racing. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let a group of petty bureaucrats steal his motorcycle and get away with it. He was going to fight them, not just for himself, but for every individual who had ever been bullied by an HOA. He started by doing some research. He dug into the Willow Creek HOA bylaws, scrutinizing every clause, every subclause, every obscure footnote. He discovered a labyrinth of rules and regulations, a tangled web designed to give the HOA absolute power over its residents. He found that the bylaws were vague, ambiguous, and open to interpretation, a perfect tool for those who sought to wield power arbitrarily. He also discovered that Mrs. Van der Linde, the self-appointed Queen of Willow Creek, had a history of using the HOA to settle personal vendettas. She had a reputation for being ruthless, vindictive, and utterly uncompromising. Artie knew he was up against a formidable opponent, but he wasn't intimidated. He had faced down hostile takeovers, negotiated with foreign governments, and navigated the treacherous waters of the global marketplace. He wasn't going to be intimidated by a silver-haired woman with a penchant for power. He decided to take a more direct approach. He called a meeting of the Willow Creek HOA, demanding an explanation for the seizure and sale of his motorcycle. The meeting was held in the Willow Creek Community Center, a sterile, brightly lit room with rows of folding chairs and a podium at the front. Mrs. Van der Linde, flanked by her loyal deputies, sat at the head of the table, her expression a mask of icy disdain. She had clearly underestimated Artie, assuming he would simply pay the fines and slink away. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Artie, dressed in his signature leather jacket and jeans, stood at the podium, his voice resonating with a quiet intensity. He laid out his case calmly and methodically, citing the HOA bylaws, the state laws, and the fundamental principles of due process. He pointed out the blatant illegality of the seizure and sale of his motorcycle, the lack of a court order, the absence of any meaningful attempt to resolve the dispute. He then paused, his eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the faces of the stunned HOA members. He knew he had them. They were realizing, perhaps for the first time, that they had crossed a line, that they had overstepped their authority. "I am not going to let this go," Artie said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I am going to sue the Willow Creek HOA for every penny they're worth. I am going to expose their illegal practices, their abuse of power, their utter disregard for the rights of their residents." Mrs. Van der Linde, her face flushed with anger, tried to interrupt, but Artie silenced her with a raised hand. "I am also," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "going to find the person who bought my motorcycle, and I am going to take it back." The room fell silent. The HOA members, their faces pale and drawn, stared at Artie in stunned silence. They had finally realized the magnitude of their mistake. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal battles and media attention. Sarah Jenkins, Artie's lawyer, filed a lawsuit against the Willow Creek HOA, alleging illegal seizure and sale of property, breach of contract, and defamation. The lawsuit quickly gained national attention, turning the quiet, unassuming Willow Creek estates into a battleground for homeowner rights. The media descended on Willow Creek, their cameras and microphones capturing every detail of the unfolding drama. Artie, initially reluctant to engage with the press, quickly realized the power of public opinion. He gave interviews to every major news outlet, painting a picture of an HOA run amok, a group of petty tyrants abusing their power to bully and intimidate their residents. The public outcry was swift and fierce. Homeowner associations across the country were put on notice. The Willow Creek HOA, once a symbol of suburban tranquility, became a pariah, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is unchecked. Meanwhile, Artie, with the help of a private investigator, tracked down the buyer of his motorcycle. It turned out to be a local mechanic, a young man named Jake, who had purchased the Widowmaker at the HOA's impromptu auction for a fraction of its true value. Artie, instead of confronting Jake with threats and legal demands, decided to take a different approach. He invited Jake to his house, showed him the custom modifications he had made to the motorcycle, and explained the sentimental value it held for him. Jake, a fellow motorcycle enthusiast, was immediately sympathetic. He had no idea that the motorcycle had been seized and sold illegally. He had simply seen a beautiful machine and seized.